Welcome back, everybody. In today's video, we're going to be discussing our pre-draft rookie tight end rankings. This is dynasty geared. Now, we don't know draft capital yet, but we're going to be breaking down in tiered rankings what we think of these rookie tight ends, which ones we would group together, and which ones we think have the most upside for us in fantasy.
So, like we said, we're going to be ranking these guys in terms of tier lists. So, we're going to start off with our worst rated tight end in the class, and then we're going to go all the way up to our tight end one. So, that'll be fun. Now, moving on to our worst rated tight end in the entire class, we have Mason Taylor out of LSU. Go ahead and give your opinions on Mason Taylor. He kind of underwhelmed us in a lot of areas, but you'll probably see there's one specific area in which he is lacking.
Yeah, so I know he's been getting some hype from the combine. Uh, from what we saw in film, I'll just say this: he is a detriment in the run game. He's not inconsequential. He's not marginally helpful or doesn't hurt marginally. He gets in the direct way of the play. We saw so many times on film where not only did he miss his assignment, he pushed the defender into his running back. I've never seen somebody that is worse at blocking than him. Now, does he make up for that? And at least in our opinion, in terms of the other areas of being a tight end that would help him get on the field, I personally don't think so. He's fine at the catch point. He's a decent athlete, but not an incredible athlete either. His route running is some of the worst that we've seen in the class on all three levels of the field. Now, he is a versatile player that can be lined up in different areas in terms of the slot, potentially even maybe out wide if you need to, and in line. But I just don't think that his pass catching prowess is really going to be able to offset what I think he is going to be in terms of being a net detriment in the run game.
Yeah, and from a person that's played tight end, I will say that this he kind of gets the mental aspect a little bit too much, I think, in terms of his route running, really, for me. So when he goes to run routes, right, I think he's thinking about the route too much. So he ends up looking a little odd when he's running the routes for me. Uh, that's just my opinion. But, if he was able to just rely on his athleticism and just trust his body to run these routes for him, I think he'd be a little more fluid for me, but he was not fluid for me on film at all. But yeah, like you said at the catch point, I thought he was pretty solid at jump balls and making some contested catches, but that was pretty much all he brought to the table. And at the NFL level, if you're a tight end and you cannot block, Mason Taylor he just simply cannot block. And he's a bigger guy too, which doesn't make any sense. But I will say teams are not going to draft you because of that. And if they do draft you, you're kind of a liability to them in a sense because when you're out there, teams know it's going to be a pass. So that's not a good thing. All right, moving on to the next guy. We have Luke Lackney out of Iowa. So things about Luke Lackney that, you know, he's kind of interesting to me because, one, he is an Iowa tight end, which, if you know the history of Iowa tight ends, is probably tight end U, and I don't know if it's necessarily close, but there's just, he didn't really see the field all that much, and Iowa ran the ball a lot this year, so he wasn't really utilized a ton there. But I will say, his blocking was pretty solid. It was above average, right? And if you play tight end at Iowa, you have to know how to block. Thought he was fairly good at the catch point in terms of making contested grabs. Wasn't necessarily great after the catch. He fell down a lot at the first sign of contact, which is something we don't like. But in terms of just being an overall athlete, just to be able to use your athleticism to get separation, I thought he was decent. Route running was definitely pretty raw for the most part, and he mainly played in line, but was able to play, in the slot from time to time, but not necessarily a lot. I will say, in terms of his career, though, he's a fifth-year player, only has 4 touchdowns, and those all came in 1 year, his sophomore year. So he doesn't have any production at Iowa, so that's definitely going to hurt him a lot.
And to add to what you said, he also is probably the worst accelerator in the class, so he doesn't really get up to his top speed, which isn't all that impressive to begin with. And he just generally, at least in my opinion, doesn't have the athleticism to become an elite route runner. And so that just kind of limits the upside. And I think he's going to break the trend of Iowa tight ends being elite assets for us in fantasy.
Oh yeah, for sure. There's definitely a lot to like, not to like rather, with him for sure. All right, moving on to our next guy. It's Gunnar Helm out of Texas. Definitely had some question marks for us. So what were you thinking about Gunnar Helm?
Yeah, so his route running is among the worst in the class, but more so his athleticism. His top end speed is by far the worst in the class. I mean, we're talking much worse than Lockie or Mason Taylor's. His catching at the catch point, it's fine. In contested catch situations, he's going to be fine as well, which you'd better be if you don't have the athleticism to be able to separate naturally. As far as blocking is concerned, he's not necessarily a fantastic blocker, but he does give his all, and he does hold his block long enough for his running back to be able to hit the hole. And he didn't really pass protect very much. He was thrown out there as I guess, a receiving weapon. But yeah, I just don't really think there's a ton of upside with Gunnar Helm. But he is supposed to be able, or he is supposed to get some draft capital. So if he does, maybe he ends up hitting. But I just think the upside with this guy is very limited because with tight ends, you generally need to be a very good athlete to be meaningful in any way, shape, or form at the NFL level for us in fantasy.
Yeah, just to add on what you're saying there, we looked at basically every single tight end that's ever been drafted over the past 10 years. And if you are a subpar athlete, you are a bust like 8 out of 10 times. Now, I will say Gunnar Helm does play with a good bit of physicality. He's a bigger guy. A lot of these tight ends on this list are bigger guys, but he does uh, be physical in his route trees, right? So he just gets some separation because he's physical there. And, his hands are relatively reliable, but he is just not very fast. And I don't know how that's going to translate at the NFL for sure. All right, moving on to our next guy. It's Elijah Arroyo out of Miami. So he definitely had some decent numbers this year with Cam Ward, right? When you have one of the best quarterbacks in the country throwing you the ball, it's generally going to help your numbers out a little bit. But I will say we saw a lot of really busted coverages to get his touchdown numbers and just his numbers up in general. Um, Especially on like these seam routes and things like that, trick plays. But I will say, he was decent at route running, not crazy by any means. I thought he was relatively an average athlete. I know he has some injury concerns, right? But was lined up pretty much all over the field in terms of out wide, in the slot, in line, things like that. In terms of his blocking, it was, average, right? Weirdly enough, there's not a lot of really high end blockers. There's a couple guys that I'll get to later on down the line, but there's just not a lot of these prototypical blocking tight ends. And usually those prototypical blocking tight ends are picked way later, sixth, seventh round guys, maybe undrafted free agents even, because that's just not really valued as much anymore. 12, 13 personnel is just not something you see a ton of anymore. So people more so want to go for these higher end athletes and then develop their blocking afterwards, right? So Elijah Arroyo is kind of one of these guys, right? I will say he probably had some of the most reliable hands in the class, tight window throws, things like that. As long as he's not jumping up for the ball, he's able to really get in these possession catches. So I thought that was something that he thrived in. But outside of that, he just didn't really stick out to me outside of anything other than like possession catches.
Yeah, and in contested catch situations, he's not the best either. But once again, we didn't really see focus drops, and he's more of a linear athlete. So if he's in open space, he's going to be able to go and get additional yardage, and so that's where I think he is best suited. Is an in space yak kind of guy where he's not necessarily asked to be in these contested catch situations. But there definitely is some upside, and he is a versatile player that you can line up in different areas of the field. So we do like the versatility. Um, but I really think the draft capital and opportunity is going to be the biggest thing for him. And having an offensive or having either an OC or an offensive minded head coach that knows how to utilize their players to their strengths.
Yeah, yeah, and I can definitely see a scenario where he is able to thrive as a tight end for sure, but draft capitals might hurt him a little bit. Now, moving next, it's Jake Briningstool out of Clemson. So, another one of these guys that's not very good at blocking. He tries, but is kind of overwhelmed a lot on film, which is kind of confusing because, like I said, he's a bigger guy. A lot of these guys are bigger guys. Um, in terms of his athleticism, I thought he was fine. There's just a lot of really kind of average athletes. There's not any freaks really in here in this class outside of a couple that we'll talk about later. But, he's just one of these kind of bland tight ends that doesn't really have any flaws outside of his blocking. I thought his hands were pretty reliable. Thought he was pretty decent on the jump balls. But, he's kind of limited as an athlete. Didn't really show me a lot on in terms of his route tree. He was mainly like a check down guy and then a red zone threat, right? That's kind of what he did at Clemson, which, I will say his numbers were pretty good over the past 2 years. I think he had like 12 total touchdowns over the past 2 years. So that is pretty good in terms of tight end production in college. But, there's just not a lot to watch on the film in terms of most of his touchdowns were just red zone catches. So he might be utilized at the next level as sort of a pseudo red zone threat.
Yeah, and he's not necessarily the fastest guy, but he does have good change of direction, and his route running is above average, at least comparatively to the rest of this class. So there is some potential for him at the NFL level. I'd say he's more of an inline tight end, but he's not generally a super athlete, and so I just don't think he's probably going to be likely to be anything special.
For sure. All right, moving on to the next guy is Mitchell Evans out of Notre Dame. Go ahead and give us some opinions on Mitchell Evans.
So with Evans, I think that he's a relatively good route runner. He's also really good at the catch point and contested catch situations as well. He's an above average blocker as well, so that could be his ticket to the field. Now we'll see about the draft capital. He's not the most versatile guy, and he's not necessarily the best athlete ever. So it's probably a tight end that I would avoid unless he gets the draft capital and gets to a landing spot that he could see the field in. But probably not going to be like some of these other guys that we'll get to in a minute that is likely to be anything substantial for us in fantasy.
Yeah, and in all honesty, I think there's only 3 tight ends worth drafting in your rookie drafts this year, honestly, and you probably already know which 3 I'm talking about. But with Mitchell Evans, I will say that there are some positives, right? Like I said, he's very, very consistent with his hands. He could be that possession type of tight end on third and shorts, things like that. And I will say, if you play for Notre Dame, you have to block well. And he does block relatively well for sure. He's a bigger guy as well, so he's not great as an athlete, but it's fine. I think, like he said, we should avoid these lower end athletes, but he could end up on a place where he's a tenured starter for a team just because of his blocking upside and his reliable hands. But definitely not a high end fantasy tight end, I wouldn't think. All right, moving on to the next guy. We have one of the better athletes, if I must say, in terms of just speed and kind of after the catch ability. It's Terrence Ferguson out of Oregon. So things I like about Terrence Ferguson, I think he's one of the fastest tight ends in the class, if not the fastest. There's a guy that I'll talk about a little later on here that's a little bit faster in my opinion. But in terms of just pound for pound, I think Terrence Ferguson is the fastest guy on this list. Very good at the catch point, very good, solid, reliable hands. And something that really surprised me, one thing, he's always getting yardage after the catch in terms of falling down, falling forward, getting those extra 3-4 yards. He did that pretty much every single time he had the opportunity to. I think he ran one of the faster 40-yard dashes as well at the combine. Pair that with him being, a decent blocker, nothing crazy, but decent, right? He's going to have to refine a few things for sure. But versatility, they used him all over the place. I thought that was relatively impressive. Able to use juke moves like elusive moves in the open field, which I found particularly impressive as well. So yeah, he's got a lot of things to like. It's just his draft capital is not going to be particularly great. I think he's projected a fourth round pick. So maybe he gets on the field, and I thought he had some pretty solid production profile as well. But he definitely has some hurdles that he's going to have to do. I will say one thing to add: he's probably the most raw route runner in terms of the tight ends on this list. He was just not relatively great there. Wasn't necessarily physical on his routes either, which is something you have to do as a tight end. So yeah, there's definitely some question marks, but the athleticism, in my opinion, is kind of there in some ways.
And if he is able to find himself on the field, he is adequate enough in the blocking game at the catch point, especially after the catch, and he's versatile enough to where there is some legitimate upside with this guy. It's just going to be an uphill battle, despite his positive showing for us at the combine. It was pretty impressive how fast he was. Um, but yeah, once again, he's more than likely not going to get the draft capital enough to be an immediate contributor.
All right, so next up on the list, we have one of Kyle McCord's favorite weapons at Syracuse. We have a Rondé Gadsden the second out of Syracuse. So some things to like. There's a lot of things to like with him. Consensus one of the best tight ends in the country beginning the 2024 season. He has a lot of really good tools. I think he's probably one of the best route runners in the class, especially deep down the field. Some of the most crazy contested catches on his highlight reel, right? That's probably because Kyle McCord is so cocky that he's just going to throw the ball up to one of his better players. And Gadsden was that. He was a very good player at Syracuse. Above average athlete, in my opinion, in terms of speed. Acceleration's not crazy. And once he gets the ball in his hands, he's basically just running straight until he falls down. But I will say, jump ball ability, top tier, might be towards the top of the class for me. That's including Tyler Warren. Uh, Very soft, reliable hands as well. He will probably have a role in some offense somewhere. Tight ends at the NFL level do have to, spend a few years kind of developing, and his blocking's not incredible. It's fine, but he'll have to develop some things at the next level. But I think he could be a solid starter at the next level after a couple years.
Yeah, and you actually comped him to a Trey McBride light. Now, keep in mind, there's the light aspect of this. But he does have the potential due to his decent route running, as well as his catch point abilities and solid after the catch ability, despite him being a little bit more linear than Trey McBride is, to potentially, if all things go right for him, be a fantasy asset for us.
Yeah, he was able to run a lot of these short kind of PPR scam artist routes as well that McCord would just zip the ball to him, and he wasn't dropping basically any of them. So that's very, very impressive. All right, so next guy on this list, a guy that I was not seeing on my radar whatsoever, was Brant Kuth. I think that's how you say his name, out of Utah. Kind of a smaller guy that had some great after the catch ability. What were you seeing on film with Brant Kuth?
Yeah, so this guy, I will say, out of all of the less likely guys to be meaningful for us at the NFL level, I would take a chance on him over any of these other guys below him. Obviously, we have him ranked a little bit higher, but still, I think there is a distinguishing factor because while he is going to be an outlier if he hits due to his size, he's, I believe, 6'2", and on the lighter side of the generally uh, necessary weight to be a non outlier at tight end. He has the deep route running ability and intermediate as well to be a contributor. He can separate down the seams. He has the best speed and acceleration in the class, in my opinion. After the catch ability is great as well. And as far as versatility, I don't know how much of an inline player that he's going to be because he's just not the biggest guy. But I think you could line him up outside, especially in the slot. And I think he could be a mismatch because, against most of these linebackers, he's just going to be too fast. And against some of the defensive backs, unless you're on the taller end, he is going to be able to be taller than you as well. So once again, he has the theoretical upside due to his athleticism to be a factor for us in fantasy if everything goes right for him.
Yeah, and we've seen here recently where these smaller tight ends like your Brock Bowers have came out and been very productive. Now I comped him to like a Taysom Hill. Now he's not a quarterback, but he is very versatile. I mean, I could see him taking like running back carries. He was definitely being played out wide in the slot and in line, which I was kind of surprised. Is seeing his size, I thought he was just going to get bullied in the run game. He held up for the most part. He's holding up versus these edge rushers and things like that. Where I was kind of surprised. He's got a little bit of bulldog to him. Definitely, super dog factor kind of guy. I mean, on film, he really kind of blew me away in terms of just his speed. When he gets the ball in his hands, he accelerates super quick and it looks like one of the fastest people on the field. And he's a tight end, which surprised me a lot. And then there's some plays on film where he can literally juke people out of their shoes and use his physicality too to get extra yards. There's just so much when I saw on film. He just surprised me so much. I mean, he's like a 7th round pick projected, I think, right now. Yeah, he's a 7th round draft pick from what NFL Draft Buzz is saying, which obviously 7th round draft picks probably don't even make the team. I think that's an 8% chance of them even making the team. But if he's able to carve out a role on an NFL team, I think he could be a very high end kind of gadget player. But he just has to figure the rest of his stuff out. But from what I saw, I didn't see anything necessarily bad outside of his size. So, all right, moving forward, now we're going on to the guys that we think should be drafted in your rookie drafts. The first one being our tight end 3, Colston Loveland out of Michigan. So, as you can see with the bars here, he's got a lot of upside, right? Very solid route runner. Michigan makes him one of the best blockers in this class in terms of tight ends that are being drafted. Thought he was a decent accelerator. Thought he was good on the snap downs on his curl routes and things like that. I thought those were particularly impressive with his size. He's just not a physical guy at the catch point. I think that's the main thing with him. I thought he was an overall pretty good athlete, pretty good route runner, but the catch point was kind of underwhelming. So I don't know what his contested catch percentage is, but he just didn't show that on film. Now I will say outside of that, he has pretty reliable hands for the most part, but he was just kind of limited. I think he's the most balanced tight end in the class.
Yeah, so he is a very quick separator. His speed off the line of the scrimmage for the tight end is among the best in the class. Like you said, his snap down on the curl routes is impressive. You can line him up anywhere on the field, in line, in the slot, out wide. He can win on all 3 levels of the field. He's one of the better seam stretching tight ends in this class. Now, like you said at the catch point, it's very erratic. In terms of contested catch situations, he doesn't really suffer from as many focus drops. But I will say his quarterback play was terrible. I mean, first of all, he had JJ McCarthy, who, yes, he was a first round pick, but he wasn't particularly great. But then it was significantly worse this year. And I did see some highlight level plays in terms of at the catch point, but it was very erratic, like I said, and like you mentioned earlier. Now he is likely to get drafted in the late first round, potentially the early second round. And there is a ton of upside with this guy. I just think that there's at least one more tight end that I think really distinguishes himself from Loveland, even though I am pretty high on Loveland.
Yeah, I think I'm pretty high on him as well. So, he's going to be that fringe first round pick range, right? So he's going to have a bunch of opportunities, a bunch of starts. So that's why you draft him, because the majority of these guys below him are going to be lower round picks, and they might not even make the team or carve out a role, right? So that's why you would want to draft this guy. All right, moving on to the next guy. One of the highest upside tight ends. He might be the highest upside tight end in the draft, with ridiculous production this past season. Most receiving yards in the country as a tight end. Harold Fannin Jr. out of Bowling Green. Go ahead and give us some opinions on Harold Fannin Jr.
Yeah, so with Fannin, he isn't necessarily the best blocker, but he is fine enough to get it done. Now, he's interesting, right? So he has this weird way of running. He's very stiff, very upright, more of a linear player. But if he finds himself in the right scheme, he is very good after the catch, has fantastic hands. And while, yes, it was a Bowling Green, you don't just walk into 1,500 yards as a tight end and be a featured member of the offense and be essentially the offense unless you are an incredibly talented player. We saw during the Senior Bowl, he had some nice reps on those one on ones, and his ball skills are pretty solid as well. Uh, where does he end up getting drafted? That will be interesting. I believe he ran a 4.71, which, for a tight end is not a death sentence by any means, but I do think that he's more of a gadgety type of player that you want to get scheme touches to. Um, you know, Rather than somebody like we'll mention in a minute where I think that he could be a traditional tight end, a gadget player, anything you want. I think Fannin is going to be a little bit more scheme and creativity dependent.
Yeah, there's a lot of things to like with Harold Fannin. One thing I will say, he's slightly undersized, but we'll see. There's more and more undersized tight ends that are coming out, right, in this day and age. So we'll see how he ends up being. But in terms of after the catch, man, he's the best in the class, in my opinion. He is so difficult to tackle due to just his ability to shake off tackles, juke people, stiff arm people. He's got a particularly nasty stiff arm. Now, he was schemed tunnel screens at Bowling Green. They found pretty much any way possible to get this man the ball. He kind of reminds me of like big Debo Samuel, right? In his ability to just get him on screens, whatever you got to do to get the ball in his hands, and then he just goes and makes plays happen. And that's what I see in terms of Harold Fannin Jr. It's like a big Debo Samuel. Now moving on to our tight end one. There's one name that we haven't said, right? It's Tyler Warren out of Penn State. This guy is one of my favorite players in the entire draft for me. He is in the S tier for us. Tyler Warren, in terms of his blocking, I'll go ahead and get the bad out of the way first. I will say, when we initially graded him, we gave him a really, below average score. I think it might be a little better than that after rewatching some of his film, but he's not a great blocker by any means. That's something he's definitely going to be improving at the next level. I will say he wasn't really used as an inline blocker a lot because they used him pretty much anywhere that they wanted to use him. They used him at quarterback, fullback, running back, tight end, wide receiver, whatever they wanted, because he's that versatile. So, in terms of route running, he's so physical. He's the most physical tight end on this list. It's not close either. He was able to basically get open by just kind of, separating himself via just a little shove or something like that to get open. That wouldn't necessarily cause a PI, cause a PI call to be called there. But he is special in so many ways. First thing, so consistent at the catch point, is going to moss people at the next level consistently. You don't have any problems with drops with him. I think he's probably the best athlete in the class, in my opinion. He's definitely up there in terms of just overall size, speed, power, all of that combined. He's very impressive there. And like I said, get him the ball in any way possible, and he's going to make things happen. He just bulldozes over guys, just over and over and over again. I don't really know who to comp him to, really. I mean, the only guy that I could really think about is maybe a Jeremy Shockey, but I think he's even better than Jeremy Shockey coming out. So there's just so much to like. He's going to be a first-round pick, probably a mid-first-round pick, so that's good. And he had the second most behind Harold Fannin Jr. in the entire country in terms of receiving yards. I will say that's adding in his college football playoff games as well, but he has some massive games versus some big time competition. So I cannot wait to see his landing spot.
Yeah, and I think one thing to like about him is I think he's going to be a little bit more situation independent than some of these other guys, like specifically Fannin, because he, much like Brock Bowers, is such a menace after the catch that you can get him these little schemed touches that essentially just about any starting quarterback should be able to hit him on. Passes. He can be deployed anywhere on the field. That is going to make it so much easier for him to hit at the NFL level. Now, one common place that he's been uh, mocked to is Indianapolis. Now, the downside is yes, it's Anthony Richardson. So if anybody's going to be able to miss very easy passes, it's for sure going to be A Rich. But keep in mind that they did sign Daniel Jones. So if the A Rich experiment does not work, there is the potential, even in his rookie season, for him to have what definitely projects to be better quarterback play at least. And then they could eventually move on and get a better play or a better quarterback rather. And that's only if he happens to go to Indianapolis. Like I said a second ago, he's pretty situation independent. I think he's going to be a stud at the next level. And this guy is going to be much more like your Brock Bowers type of player in terms of the physicality after the catch than your Kyle Pitts, who was just, a vertical stretching type of player.
Yep. Yes, for sure. All right, so this is our list. We have Mason Taylor all the way at the bottom. We even skip a tier before there's anybody uh, better than him, like worse than him, honestly. He's definitely at the bottom for a reason. And then you go all the way up to the top in the S tier. I don't think there's any tight end that comes close to Tyler Warren in terms of talent, overall, just ability, right? And then, the rest of these guys, the majority of these guys, in my opinion, shouldn't be drafted on your dynasty rookie drafts. But, those top three definitely, I can see Harold Fannin as like a third. Colston Loveland, even though I don't love the talent compared to Fannin, he's going to be a fringe first round pick, so I'd probably take him in the mid second. And Tyler Warren could even be, as early as the 107 for me. So, yep, that was our list. Also, if you notice any tight ends that are missing from here, or if you think there's a guy that should be higher or lower, please let us know in the comments. We always love feedback like that. So, yeah, that's our list. How you feeling about it?
Yeah, I'll be stoked to see where these guys go in the draft. Specifically, if some of these guys like Loveland or even if Fannin go where we think they're going to go or potentially higher. Follow the draft capital with tight ends. But like we said, I think Warren is pretty much the best bet by far and away with more than likely the most upside. But yeah, like you said, if there's anybody that you think we missed, let us know below in the comment section. We'll be excited. And make sure you join our draft party. We're going to be hosting a live on YouTube for the NFL draft on Thursday night. So feel free to come in and watch it with us, comment. It's going to be a fun time.
Absolutely. Thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you guys next time.